Awesome. So we're going to have a little panel here of these incredible experts. We're going to talk about the economic impact from macro to micro. I'd like to first introduce our panel. Ralph Martire, the Executive Director at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. With wrist, elbow, excellent. Marisa Novara, Vice President of Community Impact at the Chicago Community Trust. You got groupies here? Malaika Myers, Chief Human Resources Officer at Hyatt Hotels Corporation. You got groupies too. Good. I didn't know we were supposed to bring groupies, so we got to work on that, guys. Let's start with Ralph. The pandemic impacted our city probably more than any event in the last century, but it certainly didn't impact us equally. Can you share some thoughts about the racial and economic disparity we're seeing 3 years later and policies that can help reduce the disparity?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Whenever we go through something like a hurricane or a pandemic or whatever, it certainly creates a lot of hardship, but I think it also exposes a lot of pre-existing hardship. And that's really where we have an opportunity to make change, is if we understand what the data tell us. And it's interesting, at the end of the pandemic, so we went through all that job loss, we saw some pretty staggering numbers from an unemployment standpoint in Chicago. The unemployment rate for whites actually wasn't that bad. It was just under 4%. For blacks, it was over 16%. For Latinos, it was over 7.5%. Fast forward to the end of 2020. Those numbers have come down, frankly, except for whites. The unemployment rate for whites has gone up to 6.1%. But the unemployment rate for blacks in Chicago, this is Chicago data, is still 12.7%. And that differential between whites and blacks is far worse than the differential at the national level. And in fact, it's one of the highest differentials you see. Now, why would that be? And you look at the intersection of sort of public policy and the private sector economy, and you could see a lot of reasons for that in Chicago. Historic segregation, heck, as recently as 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that the Chicago Housing Authority, in complicity with the Federal Housing Authority, was still siting public housing units on a segregated basis to maintain segregation. That had been going on for generations. It was the official policy. And in Illinois, that had some real consequences. So in Illinois, we have historically tied things like education funding far more to local property taxes than any other state. In fact, today, we still cover about 62% of the cost of public education with local resources rather than state resources. Well, if for generations you've segregated blacks into low-income communities with low property values, they've had underfunding for their education. So they don't get to develop the numeracy literacy skills at the same rate as their white peers to go on and credential themselves at the next level. And when you look at the modern economy, 63% of all new job openings require some sort of college degree. So this gets exposed when you have a pandemic, right? And you see these very challenging numbers. And I think it creates a guidepost for what we'd have to do at both the public sector level and at the private sector level. So at the public sector level, we have to ensure that our core structures aren't reinforcing historic discrimination. So this is education, healthcare, housing, economic development. And what we do see when we do an analysis of these structures, both at the city of Chicago level and at the state level, is that there are flaws in our public system that are actually reinforcing historic discrimination. So we need to break down these systemic flaws, rebuild the public sector investment in these core services in a way that counters rather than reinforces past discrimination. Those are all long-term solutions. In the short term, you have to make sure that there are opportunities for investment to go into underserved communities that actually provide the private sector with a realistic incentive to get involved. Let's talk about one thing there, vacant property. In vacant property in communities of concentrated poverty, nothing good happens. Crime centers, drug centers, gang centers. The problem with reclaiming them is frequently because of a bunch of different laws and policies like prevailing wage and zoning ordinances, et cetera. The cost of acquiring and developing a vacant property in an area of concentrated poverty ends up pricing that property out of the market value in that community. So you've created this long-term cycle where it's very difficult for the private sector to actually play its role and make an investment and create jobs and opportunities. This is where the public sector can work innovatively with the private sector, right? And say, look, we'll cover that differential between fair market value of the property in that community and your rehab cost to give you a real incentive to come in and make the investment and reclaim this vacant property. That's just one way to do it, but the data really are there to create guideposts for future action at the public sector level.
Awesome, thank you, Ralph. Marisa, you've studied the impact of segregation on our city, which Ralph alluded to. Today, the unemployment rate for young black women is over 50%. I'm gonna say that again, because that's a shocking statistic. The unemployment rate for young black women in Chicago is over 50%, 10 times higher than their white counterparts. What are some of the barriers to employment, and what can we do to remove barriers to support lowering black unemployment for young people?
Yeah, I'm really glad to have a chance to kind of draw a connection between our built environment and employment opportunities, because that might not be immediately obvious, and I think it is really important. So earlier this year, Brown University kind of crowned Chicago as the country's most segregated city. That's not a title we want, but that's what we got. And when you look at a map of Chicago of segregation by race and income, it brings to mind, to me, a question raised by Yale sociologist Monica Bell. Looking at Chicago's segregation, she said, does this look like a place where people have residential freedom? I think we have to grapple with the answer to that being no. So what does that have to do with employment? It matters in two ways, right? One is if you imagine someone who lives on the southwest side and they get a job at O'Hare, right? Jobs juggernaut. This is not uncommon that this might be a place where you can finally get a job. And after taking a bus to the Orange Line, to the Blue Line, and spending 3 hours commuting every day for a couple weeks, you say, okay, this isn't gonna work. Let me see if I can move closer. And then you look at housing on the northwest side and you realize that there's lots of places on the northwest side where far less than 2% of their housing is affordable. By the way, there's parts of the south side that are more than 40% affordable. That's how inequitably distributed affordable housing is across our city, right? And so it makes it very, very hard for people to take opportunities if they can't be nimble when those opportunities arise. So just as I think we want people to have the ability to have lots of options about where they live, depending on job opportunities and school opportunities, it's also just as important that we're saying we need to bring jobs to people who need them in the places where they already live as well. And so we have that's where the segregation map kind of cuts both ways. One is it's sometimes very hard to live affordably in places where there are jobs. And then where people can potentially live more affordably, there aren't very many well-paying family supporting jobs. So both of those things we need to solve for, right? You asked about barriers. I mean, I just spoke about several of them. Another one is just housing instability in general, but also things this crowd knows well, like lack of affordable or unstable childcare, lack of access to technology. Certainly if you're someone returning from jail or prison, there's a whole another set of barriers that many in this room have been working on addressing. So those are I'll stop there. I know we'll get to more uplifting parts, but those are some of the barriers for sure.
Awesome, thank you. So we're going to get to the fixing those.
Yes.
Malaika, often employers create unintentional barriers in their hiring practices. We talked about one with the pink resume. What are some of the things that can be done to remove barriers, and what's Hyatt doing to be a leader in this space?
Yeah, I hope this is the uplifting, the uplifting part, or at least some pragmatic sort of ideas that we can share. The first thing I'd say, and Mark alluded to this when he kicked off this morning, one of the things that we've done is to set aspirations for ourselves. So setting out and saying we want to hire 10,000 opportunity youth by 2025 really helps you focus the organization on what is it going to take for us to do that. So one thing I'd encourage is setting some aspirations so that you really focus the whole organization on it. And then from a practical standpoint, I'd give kind of three things that we've done that are relatively small but collectively have a big impact. So one example is that we took a step back and realized we had an application, like the actual application online, that was unbelievably long. It took people 10 to 15 minutes to fill out our application. And our abandonment rate was high because people didn't want to spend 10 to 15 minutes, maybe didn't even have 10 to 15 minutes to do that. So we revamped it, and now it takes you 2 minutes to fill out the application. So simple things, but that help us get more people kind of into our applicant pool. Another thing that we've done is to take a look at our job profiles. We're looking at things like, do we actually have to have a degree? That's one aspect of it. But also, we actually engaged an outside organization to sort of help us look at how we were describing our jobs. And were we doing it in a way that was, inclusive? And were we really highlighting the things that were important to candidates? So we did A/B testing to say which of these profiles actually drives more candidates to come through. And the other thing that we've done, which I'm particularly proud of, is you mentioned maybe earlier that sometimes women and people of color feel like they have to have all the job qualifications in order to apply for a job. And we've put on our job postings, if you go to Hyatt.jobs and you look for a job posting, you'll see at the bottom, we say, research tells us that women and people of color feel like they have to have every box tick in order to apply. If this is something you think you're interested in, we're encouraging you to apply. And we see that actually we've seen an increase in the diversity of our applicants strictly because we've said, hey, if you think you're close, throw your hat in the ring. We want to get to know you. So that's another great example. And maybe the third, I'd say, for us in our industry, and particularly thinking about some of the underserved communities who may not have access to a hotel, right? Who may never have stayed in a hotel, and so don't have the experience of even understanding what might a job in this industry look like. So we've created a series of virtual reality, short, watch it on your phone, day in the life, like what does it look like in the hotel? What happens? What kind of jobs are there? Just so that you can start to expose people to sort of what the possibilities are. So those are some really practical examples of things we're doing to try to remove barriers and open up the aperture so that we get more flow through, particularly of communities and people who might not necessarily have thought of us.
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the things that I want to pull out there is, was it Marisa or Ralph that said 60% of jobs were requiring a bachelor's degree? That was you, because you're the number guy. Yeah, okay.
Nerd.
It's okay, we love nerds here. And that one of the things Hyatt did is take a look at when is that really needed. I mean, that's something we should all be doing. I remember looking at a career coach job at my last position that required a bachelor's degree, and we hired somebody with a kinesthesiology bachelor's degree because that had been a requirement. What the heck does that have to do with being a career coach? So clearly it's an arbitrary thing that can very quickly remove that barrier that many people have. So go home and do that, okay? Please go back to work and do that. Marisa, the wealth gap in Chicago is staggering, with Black and Latino families having 8 cents on the dollar compared to white families. Like, I'm going to say that one again, 8 cents on the dollar. What are some ways philanthropy can bring public and private sectors together to reduce the wealth gap?
Yeah, you may know that the Chicago Community Trust goal is to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap in Chicago. We're focused on that in lots of ways. We're looking at small business and home ownership, but we're absolutely looking at income as well. And we began a focused funding effort called Income Growth Solutions. Skills for Chicagoland's Futures is a recipient under that. And I do want to recognize Caleb Herod, who's here from the Trust, who leads that work. Thank you, Caleb. And I want to just quickly run through the three parts of that, because I think they really matter to this conversation. One is about advancing education, and we have a really cool program with city colleges and lots of ways that we're trying to help people into post-secondary degrees, whether that's associates or bachelors or what have you. Knowing that in Chicago, Black people with a post-secondary degree are 2 times more likely to have a full-time job. With Latinx, it's 1.6 times more likely. So why does a full-time job matter? In part, it's the income itself is more, but also because in this country we tie so many things to employment. Of course, that matters so much as well, because another prong in this approach is helping people build assets, not only income, but assets. And you're much more likely to have access to, for instance, a saving for retirement if you have a full-time job as opposed to part-time, much more likely to be able to build a savings account, things of that nature. So those are some of the things that we fund through this effort, and I think those are really, really important. I know that there is also a lot of appetite from our president, Andrea Sayans, and from the board just around investing in the job creation process as well. And I think that's really important to name as well as supporting philanthropically. There's also a lot of investment to be done, and I know there's a lot of appetite for that going forward.
Cool, thank you. Ralph, retention has been a hot button issue for a while now. First we had the Great Resignation and quiet quitting. It seems clear that finding and keeping quality talent is hard, and there's a division between what employees and employers feel is a quality job. I'm going to give you numbers because I know you like this stuff. So, Ernst & Young study found that salary is a top concern for 35% of employees, and 58% of employers think staff will stay in their roles over fears about the economy. Almost 4 in 10 Gen Z employees and a third of millennials said they would look for a new job in the next year, with about half of employees not worrying about changing jobs if there's an economic slowdown. So there's a lot going on there. So Ralph, do you think retention is an overblown topic, or is that a real concern?
Let me think about it, yes. It is definitely a real concern, and all the national numbers sort of bear that out. I'm going to throw a couple more numbers. The job opening and labor turnover survey found that every month in America, 3 to 4.5 million people quit their job, try to move on to something else. Other data show us that for new employees, a third of them tend to quit their jobs within 6 months. Now that's really a cost for the private sector employer, right? Because anywhere because of training, lost capacity, et cetera, it costs somewhere between a third to 50% of the person's salary you are replacing to find and onboard and bring in the new person. So this is a real challenge. And the question is, why is it going on? And I think a lot of it is the disconnect, frankly, between what employees view as a quality job and what employers think is what's needed. So a little more understanding on quality of life issues, I think, goes a long way. We see a lot of surveys indicating people want more time off for family matters. It's really important. They don't necessarily want to be harassed on the weekend at home. Pay actually matters, employers, sorry, but it does. It's usually high up on the list. And so there are a number of things that's just sort of a disconnect where maybe employers could get a better understanding of what their employees need to address part of the issue. I think the other part of the issue is making sure that the pipeline of workers coming into different jobs have adequate skill sets. And that's where the public sector needs to play a better role than it has. And I'm going to, good old Illinois in a perfect world would have greatly funded skills and schools and no inequities, et cetera. We don't live in a perfect world. We do live in Illinois. And until the state changed its school funding formula a few years ago, which actually I co-authored that legislation for the Black Caucus, we had a gap in funding per pupil between a white kid and a black kid in Illinois attending an underfunded school of over $1,500 per pupil, $1,500 worse for the black kid. Since the evidence-based model's been in place, that gap has closed to about $350. Now, that's big progress, but it's only been around for 5 years. You don't turn around an entire education system in 5 years. You need a couple of cohorts of kids to go through. So building those numeracy, literacy skills at K-12, I think, is essential. Reducing the cost of college for low-income populations generally and black and brown kids specifically. And here there's some hope in Illinois. The state has appointed a commission to create a funding formula for higher ed. It'd be a first ever funding formula for public institutions of higher ed. It is focused on equity. The bad news is the Supreme Court's decision in the Harvard University, North Carolina case creates a lot of issues about what the public sector could do. But if you take a data-based analysis, the issue of race is so hard to talk about. But if you take a data-based analysis, you see these consistent discrepancies by race that cannot be described by independent labor market factors, independent choices. They are literally systemic problems.
Yeah.
So we need to make the investments in changing our systems to turn this around long term.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, Malaika, bring us home. No pressure. You've got 2 minutes. But I know you can do it. What tactics are you using to help keep employees?
Okay, 2 minutes. Maybe two things I'd talk about. First I'd say that I agree with a lot of what Ralph said in terms of like what colleagues are, and we call our employees colleagues, so you'll hear me use that word, what our colleagues are looking for. But maybe two things I'd focus on. One is the whole area of learning, development, and growth. Starting from helping to make sure people have the skills to do the job well, because sometimes we find when we have turnover, particularly in that first 3 to 6 months, is because either people didn't understand the job they were signing up for, or they didn't feel like they had the capability, right, to do it well. So we've got a huge focus on those first 90 days of really making sure we get people set up for success, but then also painting a picture. It's one of the things Skills actually brought to us. They brought to us data that said one of the reasons we were experiencing turnover early for some of the candidates that we brought in is because they didn't feel like they understood what their future looked like. And it was a real learning for us that while we were focused on, here's your job and let us help you to understand how to do it, we have to do that, but we also have to share with them what the future looks like. So we've made some changes based on that information to really start to help people understand their growth trajectory. And then the second thing I'll mention very quickly is we've got a real focus on listening and acting on feedback. So we do a colleague experience survey. It's done on a quarterly basis so we can understand the feedback that we're getting from and our purpose as a company is to care for people so they can be their best. So we're really focused on how do we care for them, and so we ask them. And then we've got a huge focus on making sure that we're actually acting on the feedback and the data that they give us.
Please, of course.
Super, super fast. I also, I love that, and I want to just add one thing, which is that we all, in every sector all over, we all have to be accountable for our outcomes, not our intent, right? So if our hiring practices are screening people out, change them.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. That I knew you guys could bring it home, so thank you so much to our panel. Let's give them a big round of applause. Amazing.